Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. Last time we explored two of the three ways that distinguish Edenity from other paradigms. The first was that we are responsible for the contents of our unconscious, as challenging as that may be. The second was that human beings are emotive before they are willful, mental, or physical. Today we complete the series with an exploration of the third premise, that the personal self is spiritually sacred. Rabbit holes include how hippies ruined meditation, the limits of Buddhistic psychology, the true meaning of metaphysics, and of course, much more. Lastly, I'll remind you that it really is best to listen to this podcast from the very beginning and in the episode order. Thanks for listening. Okay, so here we are again. On the agenda today is the third item of the second set of three. Edenity likes sets of three things.
That's right. Didn't plan it that way. It just sort of unfolded that way.
Mm-hmm. And that this is the very important concept of the self as spiritual. Where do we start with that?
Well, there's a bunch of different doorways, but let's start with offering that the self, the personal self, has never been supported of and to itself as spiritual itself in any Eastern or Western spiritual paradigm or religious paradigm. It has always been negated or marginalized as identified as the main impediment to saintly sanctification or non-dual or trans-dual enlightenment. Those are the two main avenues of devotional and non-devotional forms of spirituality that we've evolved as a species. And the devotional says basically the self is vilified because it's infected with original sin. And the personal self in Eastern non-devotional teachings like Zen and Advaita Vedanta identify the self as infected with original illusion. And if you go into a little more standard Hindu pictures of things in the East, they're a little more generous and say that the self is infected with original ignorance. That's all. It's a sort of an innocent not knowing about the actual configuration of divinity. And so just has to learn. But either way, whether it's Roman Catholicism or a Zendo, the self is the villain. This means that it either must be transcended in some specific way and exposed as illusory and unreal, or mortified almost literally as originally sinned in the Western religionism, because we were born that way because some Eve tempted some Adam to eat from the tree of what else? Self-knowledge. And they dared to disobey God, who apparently at the time didn't want humans, the human species, to have self-knowledge, only obey it in all things. So identity begins and ends in one way. Even though it describes the self also in very different terms, and the East and the West does in some ways, it is the first spiritual paradigm that starts with the premise that the self is spiritual of and to itself. And it is not to be vilified. It's to be embraced not as the impediment to spiritual access or attainment, but as the foundation to spiritual attainment. And
we're like 2 or 3 minutes in, and I already have a rabbit hole that I just have to take us down here. because it's inevitable that someone listening to this would react and say, there you go again, Stace, saying that identity is the only thing that ever did, said, is X. And because it's an enormously huge statement to say that no paradigm heretofore has held the self as spiritual. And I want you to speak to this, but I want to say first, like, as one of the, I don't know what the word is, certainly not representative, one of the people one of the fans, how about that? One of the fans of Edenity. I would want to assert that it's a mechanism, it's a device to define what something is. It's very helpful to define what it's not. To say this is an orange and it is unlike an apple, or if I show someone one of the crazy fruits we have here in Hawaii, I hold up a soursop, which most people haven't even heard of, and they go, "What is it?" Well, it's not anything you've ever had before. Well, how dare you claim you have this elite fruit and absolute knowledge, and but I know it lands that way, and I'm sure I think you'd agree with this and probably say more is, when we say something like this is a premise that no other paradigm has said, it's not to espouse uniqueness or arrogantly say how great it is. It's just metaphysics. It's just metaphysics. The same way before the Protestants were the first in Western culture to say that the individual gets to interpret scripture for him or herself. No one had ever said that before. Every new thing is, by definition, has to be new in some way. So how would you speak to that?
Yeah. The only dimension in which I would offer, and not insist, offer that it is unique is because I don't know of any. If someone can tell me that there is a spiritual tradition, perhaps more middle between everything, like Baha'i, that's fine. It doesn't come out and say that, though, as a metaphysical premise. So you're exactly right. We're just offering premises. As a matter of real truth, it doesn't matter to me if someone agrees or not. It's up to them, between them and them, to say, oh, this is not applicable for me, or this sounds like arrogance to me. I can't help how anyone hears anything through their own lenses of apperception. So all I can do is offer premise, and you're free, of course, to agree or disagree, and please do that. We're not people who are fans of Edenity, don't insist on Edenity.
Is that now canon fans? That's the technical term.
I guess not. No, it's too. It doesn't seek followers.
Yeah.
Nor does it want to cultivate criticism. It just sits where it sits, and as that, people are free to decide if I'm crazy or a megalomaniac or something offering new that just happens to be new.
Well, and I also want to sort of highlight, I feel like sometimes my role is to like slow down the videotape and explode, like in a diagram, what you just said, because it's a very easy thing to say that prior to Edenity, no spiritual paradigm has held the self as individually sacred. But it really requires some thought, like to actually sort of process that and think about, most people are only vaguely familiar with maybe a half a dozen different paradigms, but I just want to underline, if you were to press a Zen master or a priest or whatever and say, well, what spirituality does the self have? They would probably capitulate somewhere in there and in a kind of acceptance manner. Well, of course, a Zen master might say the flawed individual, the ego, is the vehicle for, that which cannot be named to come through. So there's something, spiritual about it. There would be sort of I'm just making that up as best I could.
That's pretty good, Joseph.
Yeah, it's not
that's
bad, right?
Good.
That's my inner Zen master came up with that. And the priest would say, well, of course, God can't have its glory if it doesn't have the originally sin people serving him and all of that. So what's one of the things that's brutal in a way about Edenity is its metaphysics are so sharp that it actually clarifies other paradigms to themselves. And I think that's something that most people are not ready for. Like, many people have been Catholics for 20, 30 years. But if you come at, like we've been talking about, paradigmatic thinking and say, let's talk about the metaphysics of your paradigm, by standing in Edenity land and looking at that paradigm, it sees that paradigm clearer than the paradigm liver sees it.
Oh, absolutely right. Well said, Joseph. That was beautifully articulated. And because, as we said in other podcasts, very few people are aware of the paradigm that they have invested their whole belief system into. They're not aware of the parameters of it. Metaphysics, what's that? Yeah. Oh, metaphysics. Oh, something's metaphysical. It's supernatural.
Right.
That's how the term is used.
Right. It's metaphysics. We're so far afield from metaphysics that it's the original definition has been lost, and now it means like semi-spiritual or something rather than the rigorous philosophical tenets of something.
Yes, it's actually a tenet of, or an algorithm of philosophy, not spirituality.
Right.
And all it means is the root assumptions put up right up front, what it is that the paradigm is based on. And so what I wanted to do first, because so many people are drawn into spiritual, especially in the modern day, into spiritual perspectives that offer their content first, not their metaphysical assumptions.
Right.
If a Zen master, which, I've asked the Zen master once this question or confronted him with it, why don't you tell people that when you enlighten, and there is no more illusory self insisting that it is steering the vehicle of consciousness, why don't you tell people that means that there's no more intrinsic relationality with anyone else's I, for example? If you led with that, which is almost a primary metaphysical derivative of a metaphysical basic assumption of Zen, you wouldn't draw many followers. So what I want to do, and you beautifully reflected this, Joseph. I wanted to cut through all of that and not offer the content first. I wanted to offer the metaphysics of the paradigm so you can know within 30 minutes if you have curiosity about it. If I wanted to, as its inceptor and progenitor, if I wanted to cultivate followers, boy, I'd surely not sell the metaphysical assumptions which seem to exclusivate just about every other paradigm. And that's the space that the megalomania criticism comes in, when actually I'm just trying to be honest and save people the trouble of saying, oh, this is not for me. That's fine. Go do what you need to do. But you need to really think philosophically about spirituality to get what Edenity is trying to say in this particular assumption.
And that's all. Now we have a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, which is the philosophical and ethical considerations around letting people know what they're getting into.
Yes. Because
I can already hear a voice in the back of my head from the collective unconscious of like, well, if you tell everyone really what the path entails, whether you're a therapist or a priest or whatever, if you scare them away, then you've missed the opportunity of actually serving them. So how do you hold it as how much truth do you share? Because you can't actually tell them everything. It would take, maybe 10. First of all, it's just impossible. You don't know what they're going to actually encounter. But you also don't have the luxury of like giving them 100 hours straight lecture, even if they could absorb it. Here's what you're getting into. It's like you're going to Italy for 10 days. Here's what's going to happen for every minute of that trip. No one could tell them that.
Right.
So how do you decide what to tell people and what not to? You're obviously leading with a lot more than the average teacher would.
Well, let's unpack this because you're right. It is another rabbit hole. First of all, you said, well, you might miss an opportunity to serve people if you scare them away too much with your truth. Let's take apart that assumption for a moment. Is it my job to serve people's curiosity? No, it's theirs to serve their own curiosity. I'm just a spokesperson. It's not my job to serve you. Do I want to serve the suffering of humanity in ways that, in my opinion, no spiritual religion, Western or Eastern, does very well? I do very much. I want to serve people's suffering, but I can't serve their curiosity. They either come with a curious consciousness or they don't. If they come preloaded, Joseph, with all sorts of absolute over-gripped belief systems, what I say is going to be irrelevant anyway, because it's just going to bounce off their predetermined belief orientation. But if someone already comes with curiosity, I want to serve that open-hearted interest. And I do that, in my opinion, most honestly and heartfully by letting them know what it is up front as much as I possibly can, in tones that hopefully have bandwidths of humanity and compassion and understanding, not just smart talk. And so that's the conundrum. What happens, where does a paradigm inceptor, a new paradigm inceptor, where do they start? How can they start? You start exactly as the second part of your rabbit hole, in contrast to what's out there.
Yeah.
It's easy for Galileo and Copernicus to come along and say, in one way, well, no, the Earth doesn't, the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth revolves around the sun. But that's how they said it. Well, no, it's the opposite of what's already there in Catholic teaching or Christian teaching, right? Yeah. And so they have to contrast. New paradigm inceptors have to contrast. So I spent a lot of time up front over the years, almost, I looked at the calendar, Joseph, 40 years. Wow. It's been 40 years, almost to the month of when I started out with this orientation. 40 years of trying to get people to say, stop for a moment, breathe. And are you sure you want to be in a religion that tells you that God, who is supposed to be a God of love, is going to send you to hell for getting it wrong in the one lifetime chance you have to get it all? Is that, do you realize that's what you're in? Or do you realize all this glamour and projection of wonderfulness and attention that you get when you're enlightened? Are you aware that a certain bandwidth, if you authentically enlighten, which is another interesting rabbit hole to go down, because you can do an enlightenment talk. You can learn that and not really be enlightened. Yes. If you really do enlighten, there is going to be a bandwidth of self-personal I-ness, we can call it, that is going to be exhaled like an exhale out of your consciousness and never will come back. That has some upsides to it that most enlightened teachers in the modern day take advantage of. And there are many downsides to it, like having to relearn what relationship is, because your half of the dyad is gone in a certain bandwidth, and it has to be relearned all over again. Most people who enlighten in the modern day don't bother with that much. They just sort of write a book, and they've got it, and they really do, and then they go on from there. And there's so much glamour and wealth associated with it in the modern day. Are you really sure you want to get into this? What's your motivation for being a Catholic? What's your hidden motivation for wanting to be an enlightened Buddhist? We talked earlier about how the unconscious rules the conscious until the conscious becomes aware of how much the unconscious rules the conscious and then does something about it. How many people live that way and question their motivations, their hidden motivations? Makes me think
of Edenity is sort of like around election time. Usually it's the Democrats who are promoting voting not voting for any particular side, just get out the vote, that kind of thing, whereas the conservatives tend not to do that. But Edenity is a pro-paradigmatic awareness paradigm.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily want people to subscribe to Edenity, but it does promote, or it's for paradigmatic awareness. Whatever you're doing, it says know what that is rigorously. Know you're testing those set of assumptions, because that's just reality.
It's just lovely, again, beautifully put, Joseph. No matter if people respond to the paradigm positively or negatively, or respond to me positively or negatively, if they stick around a while, they will be educated in a certain way that there is no institutional dynamic or entity at the moment that teaches us paradigmatic thinking and self-analysis of what it means to be part of some religion or spiritual perspective, much less guides you to find the inner motivations for why you say yes or no to anything. So it's a real conundrum, and I'm flawed forever, like any other person, and I don't always get it right. Sometimes my tonal bandwidths get frustrated and impatient. Sometimes I've got plenty of good stuff in my consciousness arising in any moment, but I don't hold myself as so much as the issue here. I'm not trying to stay barren, and I'm not even trying to sell identity. I'm trying to sell, if I can put it that way, paradigmatic hyper-awareness.
Yeah.
Just as you say.
I never really thought of it that way until now. It's an interesting thing to think about, to be like, I'm not pro any particular candidate. I want you to be an informed voter and use that choice you have, however it is.
There you go.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I want to go back to it's amazing to me how well you track our rabbit holes. It's almost like you have them written down. But I want to go back to where we started, because I think there's a useful thread there when we were talking about how no other paradigm holds the self as sacred spiritually. I, of course, thought of spiritually. I thought of Ayn Rand as an interesting counterpoint, because she was the first philosopher to hold the self as certainly not spiritual, because she was anti-spiritual, but as what? Good? As what would we say about that?
Well, even though she is quietly snickered at by the ivory tower, both past versions and postmodern philosophy, they see her as a dilettante, mostly also because the patriarchal thread in philosophy is really strong, strong. And
radically misinterpreted, I find, by a lot of right-wing people who sort of go into the greed is good sort of justification.
Sure. Yeah. No, you could call, and it's not a stretch, you could call Ayn Rand's objectivism a religion. You could call secular humanism a humanism as a religion, only it's a secular religion. Secular, when you have a really clear paradigm, whether it's branded philosophical or spiritual, you can almost always find a way to brand it either way.
Right, because Ayn Rand's objectivism is a paradigm the same way Christianity is a paradigm, and then whether it's a religion or an aspect of secularism, that's a secondary distinction.
Sure.
And there's an example of paradigmatic thinking that we generally don't think. Well, agnosticism, that's not any of that stuff. No, it's its own set of stuff.
There's not.
You can't escape the
get
stuff
around this. Anytime you have an opinion about anything, you're inside of some sort of ism.
Yeah.
And this is what not thinking paradigmatically blocks out from our everyday awareness. You can't have an opinion without a value system that says this domain that you're talking about right now is good or bad, and that domain is good or bad. There's a value system. If there's a value system, there are some assumptions about reality that drive the value system. So it's impossible not to be part of an ism if you have an opinion about anything. vegetarianism, Catholicism, Protestantism, Buddhism, Hinduism.
Even if the map, and as you would say, even if the map burns up upon enlightenment, there was still a map that got you to that point. It's still an ism. There's still a set of assumptions about reality.
I'd even go further. Of course, I agree with you. I would say that even enlightened masters who say they are beyond isms are actually still in one. They're in the no paradigm.
Right.
Like Krishnamurti tried to offer back in the day, not so recent or not so long ago day, his path to enlightenment. He described it as a no path. And a no path is a path. A no paradigm is a paradigm. Yeah. You can't get around this because human consciousness cannot do without frameworks of maps.
And that's not just semantics. There was a book, I forget what it was called, but there was a book a few people recommended to me, and I read part of it and I just couldn't stand it anymore. But it was a guy who tried to have no choice and just would say yes to whatever opportunity came to him.
Yeah.
And it was I think it was called the surrender experiment. That was what it was called. And the idea was, well, if I just surrender to the wisdom of life and I try to make no choices, what happens? And it's pretty interesting. But the idea that somehow that's an abdication of choice is, no, you're choosing to do that.
It's a choice not to let choice drive your moments.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot get away from this. And any people who think they can are not aware of some basic ways consciousness operates here.
Which is not to say it can't be useful and that it wasn't educational for the guy.
Right. Yeah. But they're talking about content, but metaphysics are always in context. So you can certainly, I as soon as you started talking, I remember the film, which I couldn't bear either, Jim Carrey's The Yes Man, right?
Yeah.
Where he had to say
Same
yes
concept,
to everything.
Right.
It's amazing how that can change your day. But be careful here. You choose to surrender to whatever assumption appeals to your spiritual or philosophical taste buds at the moment. And that's not being elitist. The person with the lowest IQ on the planet and the highest IQ on the planet are bound by what we're talking about. No one is exempt. No one. And if someone dares to aver that they are, well, I'm certainly not going to try to talk them out of it. But if they are curious about it and want to ask, we will have a compassionate answer for them. And if they don't like it, they're free to go on their way, and that's okay too.
So back to secular humanism and the self. So in humanism, the self is seen to be, depending on the paradigm, good, heroic, source of power, but those paradigms push away spirituality. So what's unique about Edenity is that it combines a really good thing, we would say, about secular humanism with spirituality. It undoes that split. Why is that split there?
Well, because the metaphysics of axial age religions, every religion on the planet except Baha'i and, if you want to call Scientology a religion, I can't with a straight face. I just can't. L. Ron Hubbard.
It's not really. I mean, it's very secular humanism, and even the origin story is like, incredible. Well, literally.
They lost me when all my the reason I fail my E-meter test is because I've got alien detritus in my neurons.
Right,
and that's no joke.
That's right. That's the actual creation story.
One of their assumptions, their creation story is about that, right? Or even in Mormonism, where God is held to be on some planet in this universe somewhere. These other paradigms, you want to cut to the chase, you go right to their basic assumptions or their origin story, which we talked about maybe talking about today, because every paradigm has an origin story, and in the East, it's a really interesting origin story because there's no origin story.
The origin is you can't know what the origin is. And
correct.
Why are you wasting your mental bandwidth trying to figure it out? It's what the Buddha called that an imponderable.
Yes. Mm-hmm. If it's not possible because it pre-existed your consciousness or even humankind's consciousness, it's unknowable. If it's unknowable, the Buddha would say, I would offer, it may be imponderable, but it might be fun to play with it as long as you don't assume you can possibly know absolutely, right? But for me, in my memory, the Buddha would allow for any question to be played with, like playing and juggling balls, and see which one falls first when the thread that held it together collapses under his Socrates-like questioning that he used to do.
Right, so, and that would be consistent with pure Zen, not to investigate and be curious, whereas Buddhism, I guess, is more, well, why would you think about that? You can't actually know, and which is itself a paradigmatic assumption. It's like, okay, well, let's not think about anything that we can't directly experience, which will lead the person to a certain outcome.
Well, there's a rabbit hole right there. Joseph, want to go there for a moment?
Okay, go ahead. I don't know what to say next, but I'm sure you do.
Well, let just that thread you had. We won't take that long.
Okay.
To have fun with this. We have. This is what it's supposed to be like. Come on, everybody. We're all in this together. Nobody can ever know absolute truth. Let's have fun with premises and see how far they hold up under scrutiny that you may not have thought was possible about your point of view, right? So Descartes got us out of the Dark Ages with "I think, therefore I am," which was supposed to replace "I am unworthy before God, so therefore I am worthy to God." That was the Dark Ages.
So that was a movement. I just want to subtitle that. That was a movement from a top-down, religious, authoritarian, original sin paradigm to a secular, humanistic, the self is actually good paradigm.
Yes, it wanted to negate the necessity of a mystical context to human consciousness. I think, therefore I am, and that was the progenitor. That simple phrase brought us into the age of reason and set up the economic and worldwide change that led to the technological age. That was a little over 500 years ago. And in the last 400 or 500 years, everything that has moved the world forward secularly has been based on "I think, therefore I am."
Because the self then is at least a little bit good, so it doesn't have to be subjugated, doesn't have to pay to have its sins washed or anything like that.
It's not originally sinned. It's originally innocent, vital, and has the power to shape the earth.
And that was what Protestantism really was about. It's
yes,
like good
it had the right to do that. Boy, when old Martin Luther had the cojones to nail that stuff on that door of the
95 Thesis. Yes.
Wow.
And that's what it's so fascinating to me, this kind of stuff, because it's easy to forget that Protestantism was it was absolutely necessary for capitalism to happen. Right? Yes. Otherwise, it would have stayed in in basically a caste system, the European caste system.
Well, you bet. That still persists in a lot of small towns in Europe that still do their thing in the Catholic way, right? I mean, it got basically, if you want to reduce Protestantism's major paradigmatic assumption, it was God helps those who help themselves.
Right.
Rather than wait for God, submit to God, and wait for it to make you okay with it because you follow this and this and this and this and this.
Yes, and here's the donation basket, by the way.
Yes, by the way. Yes.
Yes. Give all your extra money to us.
BTW.
Because God really likes that, surely, your donations to the church.
So we're going down this other Zen Buddhist rabbit hole.
Yes, please.
I think, therefore I am without stretching much, an enlightened Zen Buddhist would say, I agree with that completely.
Wait, a Zen Buddhist would agree with that? Right. Yeah. Okay. I know where you're going. Okay.
Can you see where we're going is?
Yeah.
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
And the Zen Buddha says, yep, that's right. While you think your I is a solid, enduring thing, there you are.
Well, you think, therefore you think you are.
Yes, that's another way to say it.
Yeah.
So they could qualify that playfully, as long as they weren't coming from some dour kind of absolutism, and have fun with it. Because once you call the I an illusorily unreal, then thinking itself becomes the carrier wave for a false I. Right?
In Zen.
And so meditation is about transcending mentation. The route to enlightenment is to no longer be slave to dualistic based thinking. You seek for what transcends thinking. What state of consciousness is available to us that requires you to unplug and literally lose your mind.
Now there's another rabbit hole here that we're going to have to do a whole episode on, and that is I'm starting to lose my mind because of it, but because it seems to me like 99% of people who meditate don't get that that's actually what meditation is. And it's shocking. They think it's about relaxing. I remember seeing you teach, and one of my favorite things that I now do that I learned from you, and you would say, what's the point of meditation? And hear dozens of answers from people, and they were all not wrong, but far downstream of what it was really about and what will actually lead to enlightenment.
Right.
I don't know whether to go down that rabbit hole or not. Maybe we say one thing about it.
We can mention that here because it's in alignment to complete this particular rabbit hole.
Good.
The point of meditation is to seek the meditator and find that you can't find it ever. That's
you mean
the
it's
point
not about relaxing or clearing my mind or having a less stressful lifestyle? That's how most people hold it.
This is what I think partly made me prematurely bald, even though it's 70, it's pretty okay. Because back in the 70s, it started along with Jane Fonda and aerobics. What's the aerobics for the soul, And all of a sudden, because Zen in the 60s and 70s started coming into the Western models pretty deeply through hippies and LSD and all that kind of stuff. There was a whole orientation that brought forward meditation as a way to, wait for it, self-empower.
Oh dear.
When meditation was designed and is still designed to disempower the self as the impediment to holding on to an illusion.
It's the same thing people like what Tony Robbins did with behavioral psychology. They're like, ooh, let's take these elements from B.F. Skinner and whatnot and use it to become better salespeople or make goals happen instead of healing the psyche, which is what the original intention was.
Yes, exactly. So
I want to add though, because I had the same thought a couple of years ago, and I'd never talked with you about this before, but I also arrived at, like, it hit me one day, like, well, when I actually learned what inquiry and meditation were really about, like in my own experience, I started to go, well, how was this lost? And then I was like, oh, the hippies, the import of Buddhism was during a time that was all about feeling good.
Yes.
So radical inquiry and meditation that is hard and scary was all that didn't get through the hippie filter because it didn't fit their paradigm. It wasn't empowering and it wasn't feel good.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. And so that's going to bounce off the feel good priority.
Right.
It's personally attestable that meditation is inordinately difficult. And if it is actually even partially successful, it becomes terrifying.
Yeah.
There were many months before my own event that where I saw my meditation bench as a torture device. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to avoid it at all costs, because every single hour more I began to sit, my eye was slowly trickling out the top of my head and creating an enormously terrifying existential terror. So all this feel-good stuff, we talked to this whole domain, Joseph, compassionately as we can, as shopping mall spirituality. And yoga, the yoga stuff is just an extension of that. At least yoga has some benefits to the self that are reasonable, but the original yogis used asanas and mudras to get out of the self, not get further into the self. So everything's backwards and upside down, which is what the West does. The West takes and tries to make a feel-good, me positivity out of everything.
Is it what the West does, or is it what the shadow in human beings does?
Well, since the shadow is the default form of humanity, by 70%, 60 to 70%, I don't think that's too much of a bombast to phrase it like I did.
And for people who are using meditation, occasionally I talk to people who are meditating and they say, I've been meditating for X number of years and I'm not getting what I want. And like they're dead ending, like we talked about before. They may exactly need to be doing what we would compassionately call shopping mall meditation, so that they experience for themselves the limits of it. Sometimes people need to do that.
This is exactly why there's no absolutism in Edenity, and why we invite everyone to stick with what they're doing and not try to, if you're arguing with me about assumptive paradigmatic analysis, we're probably not going to get anywhere, because what you're really doing is defending your own belief system, and no one wants to change anyone's belief system. We only want to serve those who want to change their belief system, because their belief system has dead-ended them. Mm-hmm. I've seen people meditate for years just going around the same latitude of the mountain, never getting higher up to the acme or apex, or in the reverse down to the abyss. They're equally descriptive. And this is because of the daydreamy kinds of stuff that's out there that wants to self-empower instead of subtract the self. Mm-hmm. Or your grip to the self. Did we
finish that last thread? We're about the
almost 90%.
I've completely lost it. I'm so glad you have.
No problem. I got it. So the Zen master would say, "I think, therefore I am." Yes, right. O unenlightened one, that's true. But they would say, "I thinks, therefore it is." I'll say it this way.
I think.
I is non-dual, therefore I is not. That's one way that the Zen would do this. The I is non-dual, not dual. Therefore, the I is not. That's one way to say it.
It's related to, I think it was Ramana Maharshi said, the thinker is the thought.
Yes. The thinker is the thought. The Buddha would say there's no difference between experience and the experiencer. Same general principle, right? And there's beautiful truths in that. There's difference.
That's a deeper level, though. The experience is the experiencer. That made my room spin for a second.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's take a moment, because this is important.
Yeah.
When Ramana said the thinker is the thought, it's based on the Buddha's deeper paradigmatic assumption premise that there is no difference between experience and the experiencer. That experience is the parent of the experiencer.
Experience is the parent of the experiencer. They cannot be divided.
External dualisms come into our experience, and the central nervous system and the cortex does its thing, innocently conspiring to cathect all that dualistic experience into an experiencer. It's a brain function. It's a central nervous system function. It's innocent, but that's what it does. And then that becomes a narrative that feels really real inside us until you meditatively confront its dead end, its end of truth. So that's what the Buddha changed out of when he came to reform Hinduism. The experiencer is the experience. The experiencer and the experience are no different. So, because the Hindus were cleaving negative self stuff, starving themselves, living in the forest, washing themselves in mud, trying to self-abnegate the self. And he would say, "Oh, well," the Buddha came and said, all you're doing is supporting your own self loop there. It's not about negating the self. It's not about fulfilling mass consciousness samsara, the self. It's about the middle way, not getting into either polarity. And that's based on whatever you choose to experience, you create your experiencer by that virtue. Because his enlightenment was based not on the fact that the I is non-dual or unreal or illusory. His enlightenment came wholly out of that it was inexperienceable. Inexperienceable.
The self is inexperienceable.
The self. And because it's inexperienceable, it's not a noun. It's a verb. So let's have fun with that. Let's let experience be us and us be experiences. And there's this liberating, unbelievable weight that leaves you. That was his lusty, alive, lion of the Sakyas, a form of enlightenment. It was only when it moved to the Far East, that we referenced this before, almost done, referenced before, that when it moved to the Far East, philosophy, the Chinese are very philosophical, very philosophical. Just talk to Confucius if you don't believe me. He's a pretty good guy, actually. He's around. At any rate, they philosophized why the I was inexperienceable. Anything that is experienceable is dualistic. If something is not dualistic, it's not experienceable. Therefore, the I is inexperienceable because it's non-dual. And then we were off to the races. And that's what creates the fact that they redefined after China, Korea, Japan got on board, and Mahayana went one way, and Hinayana and Theravada went another way. But
hold on a second. Fine distinction. So you just made a sharp distinction between asserting what the Buddha actually taught and Buddhism.
Yes.
But it still sounds like the Buddha would not have held the self as spiritual. He would have held it as a verb and not a noun, and not said it didn't exist, but he wouldn't say it was spiritual of and to itself?
No. He would say consciousness might be spiritual.
Yeah.
Not the inexperienceable or experienceable I would offer. I'm just interpreting here, but I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of the incarnational teachings of the Buddha.
Because if he did, then there would be stuff written about the soul, and there's nothing written that holds the self sacred in any kind of way.
No. But despite what Buddhists are taught, Joseph, the Buddha never used the term advaya or nothingness. Never. Hindu influences and Far East influences began that whole track. He never used the term, and he never disallowed the soul, and he never said it was a sanctum, sanctifiable. He just took no opinion because he was too busy being the verb of himself, letting experience pour into him every moment, and not try to hold on to it. And that's a very different kind of enlightenment than what is taught now. I offer. It's not exclusive, but it's been lost to already. There's a paradigmatic assumption. When you start Zen Buddhism, it's been around for 2,400 years. The self is an illusion. The goal is to experience the fact that the self is an illusion. You've already got a premise. When the Buddha started on his path, he didn't start with a premise.
Right.
He started, suffering and death, there must be some solution for it. He literally had nothing to go on except when he saw that if you tighten the strings on a lute too tight, the string breaks. And if you don't tighten the string on the lute too much, it won't play. Samsara, mass consciousness, is the lute string too loose. asceticism that the Hindus were all doing, trying to self-negate their ways to get out of the ego. That's the loop being the string being too tight. Yeah. What's the right middle way? And that's all he started with. That was his beginning path. And he just sat passively until finally what we would call the pre-dual found him. So the whole point of that little side story is that Buddhism and Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta these days are not, even though Advaita Vedanta came later and was informed by Buddhist teachings, none of them started out raw without an assumption. Just like we don't start out raw, we only start out raw saying, Edenity's form of enlightenment, which we call mental body ensoulment, is based on the Buddhas. It's based on the Buddha's track, not the non-dual, illusory, unreal track. And so argues it's metaphysics if in an apologia, basically, and asks anyone to assess it and see if they are interested. So right there, back to the original theme that we're still on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go to.
Yeah, Buddha would not say the self is spiritual in itself, that consciousness is unknowably vast and can't be put in any dualistic box. That's the most he could say. I would offer.
What about a paradigm like, I think Spinoza maybe, or was it Leibniz? That's neither. Yogananda. That the self is made of like little lovetrons, or like, we're aspect of the divine. Does that not see the self as sacred because we're an aspect of the divine? That's more of a sainthood, leans toward the sainthood side.
Yes. He's a funny guy, Yogananda. He skated a really skinny line between sainthood and sagehood. And Edenity offers that just creates a muddled mess middle that is not paradigmatically sober. In that sense, Edenity separates very strictly devotional and non-devotional paths, because if you start skating the middle, you're gonna mush up a mashup of concepts. So I'm not sure. I would guess, this is just a guess by me, that if you asked Yogananda on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he would say the self is spiritual. And on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, he would say the self is a noetic kind of dynamic that you can't over-attach to. Yeah. So he went back and forth himself, and that's what got him a lot of followers, because, here's someone merging the great spirit and some sort of noetic or non-dual perspective. But he offered no metaphysics. He just offered himself up and his consciousness field as his teaching. He didn't have a separate teaching, really. I mean, people made teachings out of his what came out of his mouth, but he didn't start with one. Right. So, and there's some really interesting stories that show some shadiness in a lot of his early activity too, which is fine. We, including me, of all of us who try to make new paradigmatic grounds, have shadiness to us because we're all shadowed, which is, I hope, an upcoming podcast about that. Soon. Yeah, you bet. So go ahead. I think I'm just exhausted myself.
Yeah, we're getting close. But I think one of the things I wanted to say to move to wrap up here is, the more we talk about this, the more difficult I think it is to really get a grounded, applied sense of what it means for the self to be sacred. I started thinking about the work that I've done with you and Bree, your wife, and Edenity. It's like, I think it's an easy premise to say and a difficult one to fully get the import of, because we've got thousands of years of conditioning that says the self is not spiritual. And in my own experience, I'd say the deepest ways I've appreciated it is when I find an aspect of me that holds the self as non-spiritual, and like actually feel that and face that and experience the original sin type stuff. And I think you have to really sort of squeeze it up like a pimple, and it's like, oh wow, there's this really weird
noxious
anti-self thing.
Right.
And I think, one example of that I think that anyone can appreciate is what is in many paradigms called the inner critic. That is a very downstream example of like, I'm bad, there's something essentially bad with me. And I think that if you dig deep enough, you find an anti-spiritual self notion behind it.
Right. Another way to say that was beautifully self-revealing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely. Another one really neutral way of summing that up is when we say this, the self is sacred and spiritual, we're saying it's missing the self-recriminational diagnosis. It's missing its own guilt and shame. It's missing its own unreality. It's a lack of a thing that gives room for the presence of the sacredness of the self to tell us what it is. And someone might write a poem about it. I might write a 10-page white paper on it. I might make a prayer out of it. Who knows? But it's more about exactly what you just said, the lack of the negative self-diagnosis. And unfortunately, the Dark Ages, the Axial Age religions on the West, gave us a reason to feel bad about ourselves, not knowing, because it was a bloody pre-psychological age, that parenting and society now creates those kinds of self-abnegations and wounds that create self-criticism. That's been clearly now taken over more by psychology. And being understanding, and what therapy is about healing childhood wounding or societal value systems that were put into you that self-negate you. Self-negation is a dead end. Self-non-negation is an infinite open tunnel, an open space.
Yeah, and I want to add in there, so if we start out in self-negation, and then a lot of paradigms have moved forward to kind of self-acceptance, but even that Edenity, I think, would say it's not enough. It's that the opposite of the self-negation, that the self is anti-spiritual, is to see that the self is actually the vehicle for spirituality, not neutral, and they're certainly not impedimentary.
No. And I love that you say that. This is what, again, caused a lot of premature hair loss for me in the years before, is that it's a sleight of hand. It's literally, it's like what NLP does with language. A lot of gurus will do in saying, well, I don't resist the ego. My teaching doesn't resist the ego. Right. Wait. The only way, let me just say it in another way, that you're not resisting it is giving the possibility that could be real.
Yeah.
So I asked, used to be a well-known enlightened person about that one day. And I forget exactly what he responded when I said, wait, you say you accept the ego? Oh yes. We don't fight ego here. That's just ego. Ego only fights ego. Okay. So if you don't fight ego, what's your end game? That the self is an illusion and unreal. Oh. So if someone's over-attached to and over-identified with their ego, if you say you accept it, that means you have to say that you give the room for it to be real and not just an illusion. You can't say you accept the ego and still hold it as that it's illusorily unreal. That's not acceptance. That's a sleight of hand.
Well, I can speak directly to this because, I knew this conceptually from, we'll get into Stace and I's personal stories probably next time or the time after soon. It's starting to build. But there was a period of time where Stace and I were disconnected, and I was working with a heavily Zen influenced internal family systems therapist for about 4 or 5 years at least. And she was great. And being pretty well trained myself, I thought I was a qualified person to evaluate her greatness. I thought it was really good in a lot of ways, but there was something missing. And then, and that was what got me into Zen. And I had an awakening experience in 2019 and all that. But what shocked me was when I started working with your wife, Bree, again, in, I don't know, a month, maybe 6 weeks, so much emotional, unconscious material came up. More came up in those 6 weeks than had in the previous 6 years, precisely because I think that therapist was operating inside a paradigm that said, all of your emotional material is welcome, parentheses, so that we can get to nothingness.
Yes.
Which was a subtle but inevitable invalidation that my unconscious read out somehow. Said, yes. No, we're not coming out because your agenda is to get rid of us.
Yes.
And so, and that shocked me to actually put that together, that's what was going on.
Oh, Joseph, I didn't know this story specifically the way you put it, and that is so revealing. And here, let's close up with what we started with: paradigmatic edginess. Mm-hmm. The Edenity sees there's only let's see. Well, I used to have a great, funny little metaphor here, but I can't think of it at the moment. To Edenity, Buddhist psychology is an oxymoron of the highest order. Mm-hmm. It says, let me help you cultivate the seeds of yourself, grow it into a mighty oak, and then we're going to set it on fire. Yeah. So because you have to be a somebody before you become a nobody, according to Maslow's self-actualization assumption of what a functional somebody is, which is not what Edenity would say self-actualization is.
Well, and it's tricky because there is some truth to that, but it's not wholesale entirely true.
No, you have to categorize that what you are going to burn up is simply the mentalized I, because the soul I is untranscendable.
Right. And oh, wow.
You see, that's where all the harm to the heart of humanity comes from Eastern esotericism, is that they define the mind-based I, which is what's the storage on a computer that you use every day?
RAM.
RAM. That's the RAM-based you, but they define that as the entirety of the I, and that messages to those who enlighten, or as someone trying to work their honest childhood issues and conditionings, into believing that there is nothing except the RAM mind-based I, when that's just an avatar or icon on the desktop of your computer on the hard drive of a soul I. Yeah. So this is why Buddhist psychology takes the harm to another level, because it unashamedly says, I'm going to be commiserate and join you where you are in your illusional I with my now enlightened I, but I can go to that, of course, and meet you there compassionately. And one day soon, you'll be ready to vaporize your I altogether. And this is what,
Yeah. And I have to insert here, of course, that paradigm hurt me, but I'm not a victim of it, because it echoed some of what my childhood was like, where my mother said, oh no, I'm here, bring it all out, but actually wasn't.
Beautifully. Look what you just said. You needed that path and can bless it because it led you to a dead end.
Yeah.
All growth, and I never heard this anywhere else. Tony Robbins will probably steal this, but all growth is based in dead ending. Mm-hmm. It's about learning to fail, fail more and fail better, as that wonderful Buddhist teacher's book says. I don't agree with her paradigm, but she's a lovely writer, and I love that little catchphrase. Fail better, fail more, fail better. Something like that. So, it's dead ending is the algorithm of real growth. Real growth has there's no way to create, except through a paradigm, a growth path. And the growth path requires you to test everything that you're drawn to and then figure out why you were drawn to it. And that you just articulated why you were drawn to it, where you could go meta and say, she was showing up for me in a fake way. Technically, that is true, only in a different domain of how your mother said, oh, unload on me. And it was fake. It was not real. She couldn't receive you.
Yeah, and I didn't get nowhere. It was got me from A to G or something, not A to Z, but it was a necessary thing. And
you bet.
And I so I think of right now the easily thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who are working with some form of what is called a Buddhistic psychologist or a Buddhist psychologist, who is trying to take the greatest hits from two different paradigms and put them together with the best of intentions, but without realizing that inevitably invalidates the very soul, the core emotion and the soul of the individual, while advertising to liberate it.
Maybe we could talk next time, since this is where we're kind of closing, why cherry picking paradigmatic content is such a dead end.
Yeah.
How about we make that the topic for the next podcast? Because this is so rampant and feels so like the middle way to cherry pick from different baskets of paradigms. And all it does is cause huge confusion. Yeah. So let's talk about that.
And that's a paradigm in and of itself that many people are dead ending. Otherwise we'll start talking about it. We better, okay.
Yeah. Let's
shut my mouth and we'll close here.
But let's make that the topic next time, because this is where we leave off here. And again, as always, what a lovely venue this is for me and for Bree by extension too, because I share these with her. She does the for the podcast listeners, she does all the personal work with people, and I do the more the noetic and psychic reads and past life assessments that play into what the therapeutic track might entail later, identifying the themes that might that are hidden in the unconscious for healing this lifetime. That for the two of us, this venue, even though we've only have Bree, there's no phalanx of Edenity facilitators in personhood that we can say to the world, come use us. We don't have that. We're seeding something for the future. That's about it. And what is so gratifying to me that in this series is that you're taking the seed and letting it go to the wind and carry to whatever fertile field might have dead-ended in someone's heart and soul to say, there's got to be something different than this. And so that's the whole point here, right?
Exactly. I have nothing to add to that. Exactly. Yeah. So if it lands for one person in a year, then it was worth doing.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
One person is equal to 7.6 billion if it changes their life. Right.
Yeah.
It's not about numbers. It's not about quantity. It's quality. So,
And I would also add that certainly my experience, and I think I can speak for you about this as well, it's like we're just letting ourselves be led here. And so the idea of doing this podcast, like I said before, Stace and I were just having such interesting conversations. I couldn't bear to keep them to ourselves. And so that's what this podcast is. I don't know why that is. It may only be so that I can look at it in 50 years and remember when. I have no idea. We don't have an outcome invested here. We're just doing it to see what happens.
It's all unfolding process. Outcomes not our job. Our job is to be as sober and integrous in process. It's in divine being's hand what the outcome is, not ours.
Yeah.
And that's the true algorithm of surrender, not submission, but letting go that outcomes are not our business. And the West is completely based in its success models with generating specific outcomes. That's secular spirituality, but it isn't spiritual spirituality.
Right. Yeah. And there's another, it's like, Stace can't talk for longer than 30 seconds without creating an entire new episode. So
God.
We'll get to, it's the holarchy of it. We'll get to that too.
We have to say that, it's holoarchical. So any one node or loci in the paradigm connects to every other node and loci in the paradigm. And
there's a center of into itself because it's so big there are no edges.
There's no center and no edges to a holoarchy. And when we get that the divine being is structured as a holoarchy, not a hierarchy, we can really abide with that then. And that's another whole.
Yeah. 2 in 1 minute right there. All right, let's close here. We have to stop.
We better stop here.
Thank you, Stace. Thank you for listening. And until next time.
Okay.
Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.